Scholars generally agree that Jesus had at least one brother, James. The Apostle Paul references James in his letter to the Galatians, saying that when he traveled to Jerusalem, he met with James, the Lord's brother. In the next chapter, he calls James one of the acknowledged pillars of the Christian community in Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus mentions James as well, describing how the Judean high priest at the time ordered him to be killed. Josephus writes that the high priest assembled the judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So James was clearly an important leader in the first few decades of the Jesus movement. But for many Christians, James was not the most important brother of Jesus. They claimed there was another. Early on in Christian history, some Christians started to believe that Jesus had a twin brother, an identical twin, identical not only in looks, but also supernatural powers, a man named Thomas. But why did some Christians believe this? For today's video, I've enlisted the help of the New Testament scholar Dr. Mark Goodacre, an expert on the New Testament and Gospel of Thomas, so you'll see him pop up throughout this video. Dr. Goodacre will be speaking at a 2-day online conference called New Insights into the New Testament, which will feature 10 world-class Bible scholars talking about cutting-edge research on the world of Jesus and the New Testament. Among others, it will also feature Dr. Bart Ehrman. Click the link below to reserve your seat. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Thomas is briefly listed as one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, but that's all. He's just a name and a list. He gets the most attention in the Gospel of John. According to the story, Jesus appears to his disciples after his resurrection, but Thomas wasn't there at the time. When the disciples later told him that they saw the risen Jesus, Thomas doubts them, saying, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hand, I will not believe." Of course, a week later, Jesus appears again, and only then does Thomas believe. You may have heard the phrase, doubting Thomas. Well, this is where it comes from. But where did the idea come from that he was the twin of Jesus? Well, it's all in his name. The name Thomas comes from the Aramaic word for twin, which is probably something like Tooma. When this name was transliterated into Greek, which was the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean and the language of the New Testament, an S was added to the end of the name, creating Thomas. This addition of an S at the end of a word is a typical Greek case ending, and was used to fit the word into the grammatical structure of the Greek language. We see the same thing with the name Judah being Hellenized into the name Judas, so the name Thomas is a Hellenized version of an Aramaic name. Though name might be the wrong word to use here. It's possible that it was more of a nickname or epithet. See, in addition to giving Thomas a much bigger role in the story, the Gospel of John helps out the Greek-speaking audience by consistently translating Thomas. Thomas, who is called twin, translating the Aramaic with the Greek word for twin, didymus. And when the Bible was translated into other languages like Latin, they kept this Greek word didymus rather than translating it. So if you knew a little bit of Aramaic and a little bit of Greek, you'd read this sentence about a guy named Twin who was called twin. But this begs the question, who's twin? The New Testament is tantalizingly silent about why Thomas is called the twin. It never explains the reason for this epithet, which leaves an intriguing gap. And if you know anything about early Christian apocryphal literature, early Christians loved minor side characters, and they loved filling gaps in the story, because these gaps invite exploration and interpretation in spin-off literature. There's a whole category of early Christian fanfiction that elevates the Apostle Thomas to the status of main character. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas, and the Book of Thomas. These texts are actually very different. The Gospel of Thomas is probably the most famous of these three. It's a relatively short text. It's a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Because of this, scholars call it a sayings gospel.
It doesn't have the kind of narrative structure that you see in the 4 canonical Gospels. And really, you could actually take the sayings in it and jumble them around and you probably wouldn't notice a great deal of difference. So the structure is very different. There's no passion narrative, there's no crucifixion, resurrection, there are no Jesus miracles. So it's mainly just Jesus as a talking head. He does interact with people. People come up to him and ask him questions and things, but that's mainly what it is. So it's this fascinating piece of literature, this sayings gospel where Jesus comes across like this kind of talking sage, like this kind of wise man who imparts his wisdom to the disciples.
So basically it's like a book of Proverbs. Some of these sayings have parallels in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Others have no parallels at all to the New Testament and sound very esoteric, which is why it's sometimes inaccurately called a Gnostic gospel. Thomas is not explicitly called the twin of Jesus in this book, but as we'll see later, twinship is a major theological theme. The next book, the Acts of Thomas, dates around 100 years after the Gospel of Thomas to the 3rd century. It describes the missionary journey of Thomas to India. According to the story, Thomas goes along, performing miracles and converting people along the way. The story focusing on India is very interesting because to this day there are Christian communities in India that claim to originate from the missionary activity of St. Thomas.
For example, you spend time in Chennai or in Kerala, you'll find also Thomas has just left this amazing impact on the place, and usually he's characterized along the Johannine lines. It is usually doubting Thomas of John 20 that you're looking at, but not always. There are little bits of the apocryphal Thomas, for want of a better term, that have made it into that tradition too. And the Acts of Thomas already has that Indian component in there.
The Acts of Thomas also records a curious story of someone confusing Jesus with Thomas because they look exactly the same. In the story, there's a wedding, and the groom sees Jesus talking with the bride. The text says, Jesus had the appearance of Judas Thomas, and the Lord said to the groom, I am not Judas Thomas, I am his brother.
And in the Acts of Thomas, this character actually looks like Jesus. I mean, he's properly Jesus's twin, and that's kind of fascinating. Did that emerge from the idea of imitating Jesus, becoming like Jesus, becoming one with Jesus, that you then eventually make it such that the character of Thomas actually looks like Jesus? And so Acts of Thomas, which is probably early 3rd century, so it's a little bit later, but still relatively early, is playing with that.
Our third example, the Book of Thomas, sometimes called the Book of Thomas the Contender, also dates to the 3rd century. The Book of Thomas is basically a dialogue between Jesus and his twin brother, Judas Thomas, as Jesus shares with him esoteric knowledge. Again, Thomas is called the twin of Jesus. Jesus says, now since it has been said that you're my twin and true companion, examine yourself and learn who you are. Although these texts are very different, all three share some important similarities. First, all three of them probably originate from Syria. Presumably, it was Syrian Christians who elevated Thomas to be a central figure in their form of Christianity, even though he's a relatively minor figure in the New Testament itself. Also, all three of these texts call him Judas Thomas. From this, we can piece together the logic of calling Thomas the twin brother of Jesus. Remember, the New Testament says nothing about Thomas being anyone's twin brother. But the Gospel of Mark preserves a tradition that Jesus had multiple brothers. Mark chapter 6 says, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? The famous brother James appears again, but also a guy named Judas. Nothing else. The Gospel writers apparently weren't interested in fleshing out this character, though Christians eventually assumed that he wrote the book of Jude, which starts with the verse, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ, and brother of James. So at some point, some Christians must have identified this Jude, the one mentioned in Mark, and Thomas as one and the same person. And because Thomas means twin, it followed that he must be the twin of Jesus. I'm not saying that the logic is sound, and it's definitely not historical, but that seems to be the thought process that led to this tradition. All three of these texts also emphasize that Thomas had access to secret knowledge. The prologue of the Gospel of Thomas says, these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. In the book of Thomas, Jesus says, so then you, my brother Thomas, have beheld what is obscure to men, what they ignorantly stumble against. And in the Acts of Thomas, Thomas is called the twin brother of Christ, and initiated into the hidden word of Christ, who receives his secret utterances. So from these texts, we can learn that Thomas Christians, or at least some Christians in Syria who revered Thomas, were operating with a form of interpretation that might be unfamiliar to many Christians today. They were freely expanding and elaborating on characters and traditions only loosely based on the Gospels. Thomas barely makes a mark in the New Testament, but for these Christians, he was developed into a new hero of the faith.
There's definitely a really interesting story to be told about the character, and you can do similar things with other characters who are relatively minor characters in the Gospels, but then explode into life later on, with kind of speculation and rewriting, and that's really how things should be. I mean, it's all. I mean, we say fan fiction sometimes in a relatively disparaging way, but some fan fiction can be better than the things that it's based on.
Thomas's status as the twin of Jesus meant that he had access to the deepest, most secret knowledge that Jesus had to offer. But even more than that, the theme of twinship was apparently fundamental to the theology of some of these Christians. We see this especially in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, as I've said, the Gospel of Thomas does not explicitly call Thomas the twin of Jesus. It's possible that the author believed this, but we can at least identify that the theme of twinship is bubbling under the surface. Consider this passage from the Gospel of Thomas. When you see your likeness, you rejoice. But when you see your images which came into being before you, and which neither die nor become manifest, how much you will have to bear. This is confusing, so let's break it down. When you see your likeness refers to something like looking at yourself in the mirror. You look in the mirror and you like what you see, your physical body. But what about the second half of the saying? When you see your images which came into being before you. This refers to a belief widely held in the ancient world that humans pre-existed creation as beings of light, luminous beings who lived in union with God. We can think of this as our true self, the ideal form that God had originally planned for each person, which would make our pre-existent self a heavenly pattern or archetype. This idea draws inspiration from Plato, especially ideas found in Plato's Timaeus and Phaedrus, which taught that humans were originally primordial souls that were eventually embodied in physical bodies. So this saying from the Gospel of Thomas is comparing your fleshly self and your pre-existent divine self, implying that the fleshly self is a sorry imitation, simply a reflection of something greater. The Gospel of Thomas refers to this primordial divine archetype on several occasions. Jesus said, if they say to you, where did you come from? Say to them, we came from the light, the place where the light came into being on its own accord, and established itself and became manifest through their image. This belief in a primordial image or archetype might sound weird to modern Christians, but early Christians were drawing inspiration from the Bible. The book of Genesis says that humans were made in the image of God. The Apostle Paul says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Some Christians read passages like these and came to believe that our true self, our archetypal self, is godlike, literally patterned off of God and Jesus, and salvation can be achieved by reuniting with or assimilating with this true self. The Gospel of Thomas says when you make the two one, and when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, and an image in the place of an image, then you will enter the kingdom. That reference to male and female refers to the belief that these original selves are androgynous. God created humanity without separate sexes. Another early Christian text called the Gospel of Philip portrays this separation into male and female as a negative thing. When Eve was still in Adam, death did not exist. When she was separated from him, death came into being. If he enters again and attains his former self, death will be no more. The scholar of early Christianity, Dr. M. David Litwa, argues that this theology of salvation can be described as a form of deification, when a human becomes godlike. But specifically, to use a fancy term from Dr. Litwa, it's salvation by means of gemination, doubling or twinning, when the elect realize their identity with Jesus and their status as spiritual twins of Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself will become like him, and what are hidden will be revealed to him. In other words, reintegrating with my true primordial self means that we humans will achieve not only unity with Jesus, but we will become like him too. And here's where the theme of twinship comes back into play. Who else is like Jesus in this branch of Christianity? Judas Didymus Thomas. In one passage of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus pulls Thomas aside and secretly spoke 3 words to him. When Thomas returned to the disciples, they asked him, what did Jesus say to you? And Thomas said, if I told you, you'd stone me. Scholars have offered different theories about these 3 mysterious words, but some have argued they were intended to be ego su eimi, I am you. Litwa points out that this would explain why Thomas was concerned that his fellow disciples would stone him. Jesus is Thomas, and Thomas is Jesus. Thomas is the earthly twin, a fleshly reflection of Jesus, the heavenly twin, who is the archetypal human. Eventually, this understanding of Thomas disappeared from Christianity.
In later Christian tradition, the character of Thomas, the idea that Thomas is somehow Jesus' twin, just gradually dissipates in favor of this is partly what happens with canonical bias, because John's Gospel is in the canon and John's Gospel is read in church. The version of Thomas that they remember is Doubting Thomas. and say that becomes the central way that you even think about that character, not Thomas the twin, who has this kind of great wisdom and insight into Jesus's sayings.
However, even though this understanding of Thomas eventually disappeared, the twinship of Jesus and Thomas offered a theological model for many early Christians. Thomas was a prototype for all Christians, because salvation means literally becoming like Christ. From this perspective, Thomas is not simply a missionary to India, but a missionary to humanity, revealing the true teachings of Jesus. Of course, as I've said, while James probably was a brother of Jesus, any relation to Thomas is not historical, but scholars have spent decades arguing over the details of the family of Jesus.